So I live some part of the time in New York City, and you start looking at the way in which a rent control law works in that particular place, and it turns out there's a huge transfer of wealth that takes place, and it often goes to people of great privilege whom you could not pry out of their apartments on Central Park South, even though they're paying a landlord only $2,500 a month to live with them. And if you don't like that particular example, we can continue to multiply them. The second one that I always like to think of is the whole program of agricultural subsidies in the United States, which can only be treated as a profound and horrible mistake. And what is it? These are programs of income redistribution, which is designed to protect farmers against the world's price markets. And when you start to do that, what happens is people remain in a business too long, they become politically entrenched, and what they do is they raise prices up to the point where it causes genuine inconvenience. There have been a number of studies about the way in which these price control systems worked in the 1930s when the Roosevelt administration announced that the only reason we have cartels is that the people in the industry know exactly the way in which to allocate their goods. And for every single increase in price that you get through these cartels, it turned out you had a decline in the standard of living in the urban poor. If you want to try this on with respect to the minimum wage, there's a massive redistribution going on in that particular case. And it's not only from workers to employers. A lot of it is from those workers who can't meet the minimum wage standard and so therefore are knocked out of jobs in favor of those people who are above the standard in question. So if you just look at the recent ill-considered increases in the minimum wage that have taken place over the last 3 years or so, the net effect that one regrettably sees about this is a very high rate of increase in the amount of teenage unemployment, particularly among members of minority groups. So what's the particular concern that you have here is quite simply this. You start running these kinds of redistribution programs, you then end up in the sort of Yale universe of Jed Rubenfeld in which you don't know what property rights are, therefore you can't figure out what redistribution is, and that opens the way for all sorts of horrific things that he would never defend on principle, and the only way in which you can oppose them, in my judgment, is to start to put together a kind of a coherent program which goes on exactly the opposite direction. You don't want to start with an illustration of how the government doles out things. You want to ask the question of how it is that the government got those things to dole them out in the first place. And once you understand that those things are coming from tax revenues from ordinary people, all of a sudden the level of constraints that you'd want to put on what it is that the state can do with them is vastly different. So essentially, when you start looking at this whole problem, I'm just going to summarize it in one sentence now, is that the difficulty that you have with respect to redistribution quite simply is that the moral case for some is quite compelling, but the level of erosion that the principle has when you try to do it through legal enforcement turns out to be enormously great for a variety of technical and political problems. Smart people, when they realize how difficult this thing is, don't want to make it the centerpiece of their program. They want to see the rest of the house in order and only then turn to redistribution. So I will end on this note. Redistribution last is the way in which I think you ought to organize the social order. Thank you.
Our third speaker is Andy Stern, who is the international president of the 2 million member Service Employees International Union, which is the fastest growing union in North America. Mr. Stern is has been hailed as a different kind of labor chief and a visionary leader who's charted a bold new course for American unionism. Andy Stern began working as a social service worker and member of SEIU Local 668 in 1973, and he rose through the ranks until he was elected president in 1996. Mr. Stern led SEIU out of the AFL-CIO and founded Change to Win, which is a new 6 million member federation of 7 major unions, dedicating, as he puts it, to giving workers a voice at their jobs. And Andy, we're delighted to have you here and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Good morning. Where Jed gave you a kind of legal perspective and Jed gave you a historical and Richard gave you a legal and moral, I understand why I didn't go to law school now, which is probably not the right thing to say in front of this group. So let me just try to give my version of a real-life, contemporary American discussion about the issue of redistribution. Let me just start by saying I love this country. I happen to think America, it's a gift. And its greatest gift is that people like my grandfather Lewis came here from all over the world. All they ever expected is they were going to work hard. All they ever hoped for is their work would be rewarded. But what they dreamed about was their children and their grandchildren were going to lead a better life than they did. That is the unique and wonderful and most special American dream. And despite a civil war, 2 world wars, recessions, depressions, natural disasters, 44 different presidents, the American dream has endured up until now. Frank Luntz said the other day that 70% of Americans now believe that their children and grandchildren will not lead a better life than they have. That is not the America I want. That is not the America we need. And that is the discussion I think we are failing to have in our country right now. This is not our father's or our grandfather's economy, and I appreciate all the legal history involved in this room. And for those in my party who are longingly looking for the return to the days of the New Deal, it's important to appreciate that we're as far today from the New Deal as the New Deal was from the Civil War. And I'm sure Franklin Roosevelt admired Abraham Lincoln. He did not build an industrial economy around 1865. We are going to not build a global economy around 1935. And the basic point I want to make here today is our country and the rest of the world is living through the most profound, the most significant, and most importantly, the most transformative economic revolution in the history of the world. I mean, there have only been 3 economic revolutions. The agricultural revolution, it took 3,000 years. The Industrial Revolution, it took 300 years. This revolution, and this is the 3rd economic revolution as we change from a national to an international economy, from manufacturing in the United States to a service, knowledge, green economy, this revolution is only going to take 30 years. This revolution is televised, it's Googleized, it's digitized, it's on your screen, in your face, 24/7. It is relentless, it is unending, and most importantly, it's far from over. And we now can see some of the implications that apply to redistribution in all of those changes. The world, as Thomas Friedman says, is basically flat. We now live in a global, more integrated economy where we compete not nationally, but internationally. Success in the 3rd economic revolution is really not about the competition that when I grew up between the states in the North and the South, or between business and labor, or Democrats and Republicans. This is not even a competition anymore about the old competitors in Europe or south of the border. This is about a competition with growing competitors in the South China Sea. China, as we all know, has surpassed Japan as the 2nd largest economy in the world. It will soon, in the next 2 decades, be the largest economy in the world. And as a side, I just want to say, I'm not a finance major, don't know much about global international finance, but when my banker has $1 trillion of my debt and it has a foreign policy and an ideology, I get nervous about the future of our country. The other result of all this change has been this whole question of the distribution of wealth. If we do believe the old model was that capitalism, and despite what Glenn Beck says, I am a capitalist, not a socialist, communist, or anything else he's called me in the last 2 weeks, capitalism did create American prosperity. Governments created the legal and social environments in which prosperity could be broadly shared. Unions were actually created to share prosperity not across sectors or across nations, but within a firm. And then markets were seen as the best way we had to redistribute wealth. And the result of that formula was America created the greatest middle class in the history of the world. It was the envy of every other country. We bragged about it throughout history. And then what happened? Well, in the last 30 years, we've replaced that ideology where we said, and many people on the stage may have said, where government and union activity should be constrained, or actually even ultimately replaced by pure market forces.